As any parent could possibly tell you, the thought of running a D&D game with kids is probably along the lines of, trying to make it through the week without, doing something wrong or making a mistake. It seems impossible. And yet, we have two guests today that not only have done it, but do it regularly and to some success, actually. We are joined by two members of the team at the kids table. And yes, I already did ask if there is an adults table, but if you want to know the answer to that, you'll have to ask them yourself. This is How to Be a Better DM, the show designed to help you become the world's greatest dungeon master without breaking the bank, spending all of your time, or ruining all of your relationships. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Tanner Wayland. Tanner, how you doing?
Great. Just, wonderful. I don't know if you know this about me. I think I mentioned it forever ago. I was originally going to be a teacher. That was what I was studying to be. And then I got really stressed and I switched. But before then, very passionate about helping, kids develop and grow. And I think D&D is a great, unexpected way to do that. So I'm super excited for today.
Yeah. I know that for most people, having children in their life is something that they desire. Most people want to become parents. And for most people, having children in their life is also kind of an inevitability because if you don't want to be a parent, you probably have people in your life who are. And as I said, we're joined by two members of the kids table team. We're joined by Ryan and Allison. Go ahead and say hello to the audience and also give us an introduction to who you are and what the kids table stands for.
Okay, I'm Allison. I am the creative and business lead side of the Kids Table D&D. If you don't know us, the Kids Table is a family-friendly, kid-focused Dungeons and Dragons show. Primarily, we have an original actual play campaign on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. But we also like to do clips and tip videos for playing with kids. And we also write our own campaigns and other D&D resources that are designed to make playing with kids easier at your home game.
My name is Ryan, and I am the storytelling and tech lead at the Kids Table. And the reason that we started doing the Kids Table, we launched it about a year ago, even though we had filmed a lot of our content almost 3 years ago, was because we looked around the D&D actual play space and saw a lot of really good stuff with adults and almost nothing for kids. And Allison and I both come from education backgrounds. We both value children and teenagers. We both have children in our families. And we wanted there to be examples out there for grown-ups to see, for parents to see, but for kids to see mostly, for kids to see kids just like themselves doing Dungeons and Dragons and telling stories, because that's ultimately what this is about. Kids are natural storytellers, and D&D is just a vehicle for telling a good story.
I gotta say, I am 100% behind your guys' mission. When we started How to Be a Better DM, and later we started our actual play, The Pact and Boon, one of the things that I was really kind of persistent on is I wanted our stuff to be maximum, PG-13. And I think I'm kind of a PG kind of guy just naturally. But more than anything, I noticed that, I like to listen to actual play shows, and I have a 1.5-year-old, and I realized that there's going to come a point in time when he's going to be able to understand some stuff, and I won't be able to listen to those shows while I'm driving in the car or while he's around. And I think it's definitely a travesty that so much content around there around D&D is not kid friendly, especially because when you're kids, you play pretend without rules, so D&D is kind of this natural progression. So big kudos to you. Tanner, it looks like you're wanting to say something.
Mostly, I was just kind of curious. When you guys first had this idea, so you said you were both in education already. Did you start out being like, okay, let's look for kids on that side, or did you is it your own kids who are in the podcast? I was just curious about that.
So when we originally had started thinking about it, Allison was mentoring some teenagers who were going through teenage times, and we put our heads together and came up with a quick one shot for the teens just to see what would happen, to see if we could get them dialoguing, and it worked. Like it seemed it seemed to help open them up and get them talking to each other. And that's where we sort of came up with the idea of the kids table and took that forward. The kids that are on the actual play show right now, one of them is my son. In season 1, he was 6 years old. And season 2, which just dropped today, the first episode just dropped today, he's now 9. One of our mutual friends who has a daughter is the same age as my son. And in that first season, we also had a teenager. Alice was 17, I think, because we wanted to have sort of that mix of ages and give Alice the teenager space to sort of lead at the table too, to sort of be in that in between space where the adults at the table could sort of be mentoring Alice, and Alice could sort of be mentoring the 2 6-year-olds. Yeah, and so it's all kids that we know, kids that are in our orbits.
I love that. And so, well, I have 2 questions from that. I'll start out with the mix of ages one, because I think that's interesting. Is that hard? Because like obviously the teenager, depending on how into it they are, like I think teenagers have a great capacity for being like, oh, this is what this is about. But I mean, 6 years old, being with a teenager, like how does that affect how you DM to them? Like,
yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, so one of the reasons we chose Alice for season was because she had worked with little kids before, and so she was sort of in a space where she understood what it meant to be around a 6-year-old and to sort of guide them in certain directions. This season, we have the two 6-year-olds are now 9, and Alice graduated and went off to college, and so we found another teenager who's 14, and he's sort of in a mentoring space right now where we're sort of training him to be able to be with kids at the table. So it's interesting to see the difference between Alice and his name's Dylan. It's not that difficult though, because once teenagers are in a safe space, and Allison can say more to this, but once teenagers are in a safe space, they just want to play. Like they sort of start dropping the pretense of high school and middle school, and if they're in a place where they feel like they can be their authentic self, it isn't really all that different from being a kid.
I love that.
Yeah, I think that teenagers are in a really unique space to be a mentor to children because, I mean, we all remember being kids, elementary school kids, and seeing those teenagers and being just in awe. And oh my goodness, if they ever gave you some attention, just how much that meant to you and how that was so significant, even more than adults giving you attention sometimes. Um, and then, yeah, like Ryan said, on the flip side, kids as they're growing into teenagers, it's kind of an awkward space because some people treat them as adults, some people treat them as children, but they're kind of their own unique thing. So as they enter adolescence, they start to feel like they have to separate themselves from children, so they're not treated as children anymore. So at that stage, usually they kind of push away from any like kids' stories, kids' games, kids' activities. But Ryan's right. Yeah, once they hit a certain age and have started to discover their own unique identity and have a little bit more confidence in that, they kind of return to thinking that, like, from in the right environment, that kid stuff can be cool. Like some of the teenagers that I worked with, it wouldn't not really work in middle school, but in high school, sometimes I'd be like, okay, like we're gonna remember when we were little kids, and I'm gonna read you a bedtime story, and everyone's gonna lay on the ground, and I'm gonna hold open the book like when you were in kindergarten, and they would like that to kind of have that moment at a certain stage. So yeah, there's definitely a good cohesion between kids and teenagers.
I love that. Tanner, I think you said you had 2 questions, or
You go first. I've got 1,000.
Perfect.
You go.
So, I do have a question, and it's funny because I said we were going to do a warm up, but you know what? We're just going to skip the warm up. So you said with the teenagers you first started working with, you wanted to get them dialoguing. And I think that was really interesting. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean specifically with that?
Yeah, so teenagers, not all teenagers, but a lot of teenagers put up a front, right? It's hard to live into who you actually are, and it's scary to discover who you are too. And that's part of the work of being a teenager, right? Is understanding your place in the world and your place against the world, and where those edges match and where those edges have friction. And so it's really easy for some teenagers to build a wall, build a mask where they can't, or where they choose to engage in a specific way, right? That may not be their authentic self, but may be the way that they think they have to engage with the world. Getting those teens around that first table was really enlightening. I will say I found it frustrating. Allison is the teenager person, and I'm the kid person. So I just wanted to be like, guys, what is happening right now? Like we set up a puzzle where they had to cross a river, and they had an NPC with them that they wanted to protect. And one of the teenagers decided to just boot the NPC into the river, and I'm like, what is happening right now? And Allison very calmly DMs just this very beautiful rescue of the NPC. Um, but ultimately, what it led that group to do was break down some of those barriers. And I mean, Allison can talk about this more, but it helped them through the medium of play uh, take some of those walls down just a little bit, so they could see each other's authentic selves.
Go ahead, Allison.
Yeah, they were that particular group had been really close for a lot of years and had been involved in like a lot of our leadership programs, and they were at that age. It was I think it was summer between 8th and ninth grade is what it was. And at that age is like really a big shift, and people tend to drift apart, and we were really kind of trying to make a move to try to keep them together. So that was really, really what was going on there. Yeah.
That makes sense. So
Yeah.
I think the main reason I was interested in that is because with D&D and its sort of storied, more or less, history, for people who've never played it, it can have sort of a lot of connotations. And I think the idea of breaking down these walls and getting people to not just play, but like commit to the game, kind of invest themselves, I think that is a very common challenge with DMs worldwide. With any group, you can have one player who's just, for whatever reason, they're just not into it that day. So what do you think it takes to get those walls to come down a little bit and get people to sort of relax and just kind of invest in the game?
Well, that's the whole idea behind role playing, right? Is that you're putting on this mask and you're playing a role, so you can step out of your comfort zone and you can do things that you would be maybe afraid to do in social situations in real life when there's no mask, right? And that's why it's so great for teenagers as they're kind of trying on these different identities and they're learning new skills, especially social skills. They can take those little risks in a very low risk type of setting, because if the NPC doesn't like their character, that doesn't affect their real life that much as it would if a person at their school didn't like them, right? So it's a good way for them to kind of try on roles, to grow their confidence and figure out what they're good at, and figure out the skill of relying on others for things that maybe aren't your strength and are somebody else's strength. So we really are a big proponent of D&D as a developmental support tool in the areas of like critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, communication, confidence. There's so many different things that the players can exercise in the game that's actually impacting their real world life and growing those real world skills.
And I'd say too, one of the rules. So we've got three big rules at our table, and one of the rules is we play this. It's a game, and it's supposed to be fun. And when it stops being fun, we stop playing the game. And it gives the kids at the table the ability to opt out if they're not feeling it. And that's been huge for us because with the 6-year-olds 3 years ago, there was a situation where Chloe, who this was the first time she'd ever played D&D, she made a bad roll, and that's all it was. Like she failed a roll, and that just crushed her, like her little 6-year-old heart. It just absolutely crushed her. And we stopped the game, and we stopped the video, and we said it's just a game. That's okay. If you don't want to play anymore right now, we can come back to it later. And that gave her the space to take a breath and take a walk around the house and then come back and sit down. And I'd say for teenagers it's the same thing. If they feel like they're being made to do it, they are going to resist it 9 times out of 10. But if you give them the space to say, it's a game and we play it because it's fun, and if it stops being fun, we can stop playing, that gives them the space to have the fun, right? It gives them the space to look around and see, how can I make this fun, instead of how can I make this not fun.
And one thing you touched on there, Ryan, that I want to point out is with those, like, taking those risks and the choices that your character makes, you can blame your failures on the roll, right?
Yeah.
It's not like I failed at trying to make friends with someone. It's like, oh, I rolled a natural one, you know? So it makes it less personal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was curious because you were talking about that role playing and how it kind of frees them up. I wonder, are there some kind of skills that you almost need to prime them with? Or like that you need to discuss and be like, hey, role play, like what does that look like? Or do you kind of count on them to passively pick that up as you create an environment with your DMing?
Yeah. So with young children, at least, the role playing at the table is essentially just them. So my son is playing a dragonborn, but it's really just him. Like he's the one sitting at the table. He's the one providing the voice. He's sometimes using Sixtail's name, but mostly it's just him at the table. Which is fine, right?
Yeah.
That's a developmental thing for kids. They can't necessarily bifurcate that, but kids are natural storytellers. Kids will run around doing imaginative play all the time, so you don't necessarily need to prime them on how to imagine. More, what you need to do is help them learn how to imagine together, right? Kids are egocentric. Even teenagers can tend to be egocentric sometimes. And so it's as much helping them understand that what they're saying is just as important as what somebody else is saying. And the way that that person is playing their character needs to impact what they're doing too. So if you want to go this direction down the cave, but your friend wants to go this direction down the cave, you don't necessarily need to split the party. You need to have a conversation. And so that's part of the role of the DM, is to draw them more into that critical thinking process than it is necessarily even to help them role play. Because again, kids are just going to want to tell a story.
Yeah, I was curious about that because I love that you're like, hey, the DM needs to be the one to facilitate that. Because as much as you can have an initial rule that, like, hey, we hear each other out, we give each other turns to speak, having that rule would be helpful, but it's easy to forget in the moment. And so I think being like, okay, I've heard you, now what is your character's thing? I think that's a great, I mean, it's an important skill for DMs to do with adults, but for kids, it's literally a skill you're teaching them for the first time in many ways, right? And on that note, do you feel like there's any other, I don't know, skills that that kids can pick up from D&D that's useful in everyday life?
I think one thing that I've had to kind of break down a little more than I anticipated when I play with kids is just decision making. D&D tends to be like a sandbox style game where a DM with experienced adult players would say like, what do you guys want? Here, you're in this town. Here's the map of the land. What do you guys want to do? And it's pretty open. But if you present that to a kid, they're not even going to know what the options are for what they could possibly do. So one thing that we like to do with new kid players is give them a few suggestions. And if they come up with something totally different, fine. But that just kind of gets them started, gets the ball rolling with ideas for decisions that their character or their team can make. Did you have something else, Ryan?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I feel like knowing what's on your character sheet is also just really hard for a kid. Like, and that's a skill that they have to develop too. Because depending on the age of the kid, right, a typical D&D character sheet is just going to be completely opaque for them. So we've created a simplified character sheet that we use for kids, but even for like some young children, right, if they're early readers or if reading is something that they're still learning, struggling with in school. One of the things that we do as DMs is we have their full character sheet behind the DM screen. So we can sort of lead them on a process, and for the first couple of sessions, just say, what do you want to do with this situation? Here's the situation. What do you think you would like to do? And then we figure out the mechanic part of the roll of the dice, right? So, okay, so that would be a perception check, or that would be a strength check, right? We're not requiring them to come up with those sorts of ideas. We're giving them the opportunity to say basically whatever they want, and then we're putting onto what they say the D&D mechanics. And as we go on, like you can watch the first season and you can watch Beckett and Chloe sort of grow into this. By the end, they know the checks that they want to make. I want to make a perception check. I want to make a stealth check, which is language that they didn't have at the very beginning. And so that helps give them that language, that shared language for the table. But it also feeds back into what Allison was saying, that decision-making process, because then they have a toolbox that they can draw from rather than just sort of come up with it.
You work 8 hours a day. You spend time with your family, and when you come home, you do work around the house. And it seems that you never have as much time as you would like to prepare for your D&D sessions. Does this sound like you? Wouldn't it be amazing to have endless material prepared for your D&D sessions anyways? That's where Roll & Play Press comes in. Roll & Play Press provides D&D 5e compatible material for any type of session. Running a one-shot? Check out their One-Shot Wonders book with over 100 one-shot ideas. Getting started with a new sci-fi campaign? Get their Game Master's Sci-Fi Toolkit to have your games much more prepared with much less effort. Why reinvent the wheel? Check out Roll & Play Press at rollandplaypress.com, see what they have to offer, and get a 10% discount when you buy something by using the code BETTERDM10, that's BETTERDM10 at checkout. Give yourself just a little bit extra help so that you can continue being the world's greatest dungeon master. You obviously have good taste. I mean, you listen to How to Be a Better DM, after all. We thank you so much for your support. And if you've ever gotten anything useful from How to Be a Better DM, take a minute and rate us and review us on your podcast listening app of choice. It goes a very long way to helping our show help many more dungeon masters out there who are just like you. If you love our content, help others become better dungeon masters too. Hey, bud. How's it going? Just wanted to say, we like you. We think you're pretty cool. And we hope you like us too. If you do like us and what we're doing, you can support us on Patreon. Just $1 a month is enough. Just go to sessionzerostudios.com/Patreon and show your support. But even if you don't, we still like you, bud. See you around, bud. I think one thing that is just impressing me so much right now is how both of the things you just said are things that apply extremely well to a new adult players as well,
Yeah.
right? What do you want to do? What can I do, right? Well, no, just worry about what you want to do and then I'll help you. I think that method is one of the best ways to help people just enjoy D&D in their first session and then kind of dig deeper. And I also liked what Allison said about the decision making. We've talked on this podcast a lot about player choice and railroading and sort of the spectrum there and the pros and cons and all that jazz. But I really liked sort of the principle behind what Allison said of understanding your players and where they're at, and then offering the field of choice based on where they're at, right? So for kids, they're new and making decisions is kind of hard, and honestly, for some adults, it's kind of that way too. I think that giving suggestions or here are some options, or honestly just limiting what they can do, right? You can do this or that. What do you want to do? Excellent things that you guys have said. Kind of going back, so D&D, you guys use D&D as this developmental tool. You guys are educators, which, my mom and dad are both teachers too. So I know the schooling you guys have gone through and the ongoing education you guys do every year. For average everyday Joes like me who are just parents, how can we turn D&D into a developmental tool without necessarily having all the education that you guys do?
I think just pay attention to where your kid is at and what they are working on, what are some skills that they need to work on strengthening in the real world, and just figure out ways to present those as opportunities in the game. It really is just a shared story that you're telling together, which, many parents practice even with toddlers at bedtime. I'm going to tell a story and then the kid interjects, can the wizard have a unicorn and a sword? Sure. Okay. So you really kind of start the foundation level of telling a story together quite early, and you both kind of get better at improv as you go and are able to, I think, incorporate things that they're focused on. There's also a ton of resources and more all the time for really it's kind of more framed as educational TTRPGs out there that are being used in schools, that are being used in libraries, that are being used in special needs programs. So there's a lot of resources out there that can kind of start to give you ideas of how to incorporate like literally any subject. That I saw a TTRPG that was teaching kids about photosynthesis. So you can pretty much incorporate anything into your story.
That makes me think of the Magic School Bus.
Yep,
Where
same thing.
which is super cool to be honest, but that is amazing. One other question I had, kind of along the lines of, as a parent, does playing with mixed ages change at all if the players are all siblings?
Sibling dynamics can either be very great or very difficult, depending on the day or the phase of the moon or what side of the bed they woke up on, right? Like, that can be difficult. But I would say that it's less about the mix of ages and more the mix of personalities, right? It's not necessarily that you are. So Beckett is 9 now, and I have a 6-year-old son named Oren. 5. He's 5. And when we play with the two of them, one of the biggest difficulties that we encounter is the competition between the two of them, right? If one makes a good roll and one makes a bad roll, the one that made the bad roll is just madder than all get out. And so we have to work on the cooperative element of the game much more than I usually do with mixed age groups that aren't siblings, right? Every family's got a different dynamic. So maybe competition isn't the dynamic in yours, but whatever that dynamic is, that's the thing that you need to pay most attention to and figure out how to diffuse through puzzles, diffused through storytelling, diffused through multiple intelligences. So, some kids aren't going to be the math kids; they're going to be the sort of physical kids. And so, great. So make them do a physical challenge, run around the house 6 times or something, right? Yeah, it's a dynamic thing more than an age thing, I'd say.
Kind of along with that. So recently, over the Christmas break, I got to see my nephews, and them and a couple other family members wanted to do D&D, and these were all basically new to the game. And my nephews one was 10, one was 12. And it was interesting because I realized that my normal method of prep could have used some work. Because for example, the 12-year-old, like, he actually, like, near the end, he was really getting into it, and I loved that. The 10-year-old, I realized, I was like, man, I think I needed to do maybe fewer encounters and more like puzzles and stuff where, like, he's not waiting his turn because his, like, attention just, like, shifted often, And I was curious, have you guys found that you need that what you prepare or the types of stories you tell are different with kids, or like how does that preparation differ?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So there's a developmental thing that's happening there, right? That kids, because of the way that their brains are still forming, kids under 10 generally can't do a lot of abstract thinking. They're much more concrete processors. And so that's where puzzles really are helpful for elementary age kids all the way up to age 10, sometimes 11 and 12. So not just mind abstract puzzles, but physical things on the table. So like a literal puzzle that they have to put together, or something that they have to build out of Jenga blocks. We did a Tetris thing and what are those called? Tangrams. We did a tangram puzzle one, and that was really good for that age group. Limiting the number of encounters is also pretty helpful. Thinking along the lines of what a story arc looks like, right? That there's a distinct beginning, middle, and end. Even if you're going to have multiple sessions, each session should have its own mini beginning, middle, and an end, even if that end is a cliffhanger. And generally speaking, the encounters, the DM has to be fast because the kids won't be. Because the kids won't know their moves, their spells. They're going to want to talk it out every time. They're not going to be prepping their turn while other people are going, because hopefully, actually, they're paying attention to what the other kids at the table are doing. So you as the DM have to be thinking 2 or 3 or 4 turns ahead. Like, so this kid is doing this right now. This monster is about to be dead. What is this kid going to get to do next, right? So your prep has to be more flow in that way.
I just gotta say, I wrote down what you just said there. Each session should have a beginning, middle, and end, even if that end is a cliffhanger. I think, while it seems super simplistic, I think that is extremely wise. And honestly, this is one reason why I think most people should try DMing for kids, because simplification is really how you tell if you can understand something and if you're good at it, right? And I think DMing for kids, and actually maybe this is an assumption that you guys will have to check me on, because honestly I haven't done it yet. Do you have to simplify a lot of things for kids when you DM for them?
It depends on what you mean by simplify. I mean, you've got to simplify the language for sure. They're not going to have the D&D vocabulary that veteran adults are going to have. So you're going to have to simplify the mechanics in the way that you describe them, but not necessarily in the way that you execute them. Spell slots still matter. You just might talk about them in a different way. Modifiers and sneak attack and advantage and disadvantage, they can do all of those things if they are told how to do it, right? So it's the difference between I don't know, like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, right? The Hobbit is like the easy reader, quote unquote, version of Lord of the Rings, but it's still dealing with the exact same themes. It's still dealing with the exact same archetypes, the same character interactions. It's just presented in a slightly different way. Yeah. So, Allison, what do you think?
Well, I was going to come at it from a perspective of like helping a kid who's for very first time playing D&D, or like very young kids, like pre-readers, preschoolers. We start with just, at least in my experience, I start with just telling a story together, where I'll kind of have them choose the scene, who their character is, what they have. I'll say, we're going on a journey. Where are we going? They choose the destination, the method of travel, their resources, and their character. And then I present a problem. And then they have to come up with a solution to overcome that problem. And then I narrate what happens next, and we kind of keep going. No dice, no mechanics. That's the very first encounter with role playing with D&D. Then with my daughters, as they got a little bit older, like maybe 4 or 5, I started just adding a D20. And if they rolled over 10, their attempt to solve the problem was a success. And if it was under 10, it was not. And kind of as they went, we kept adding more. We started adding damage dice and stuff like that. But in the beginning, it was very short and very simple. And in that same spirit, Ryan and I have written a series that's called 15-Minute D&D, which is intended for a kid's first encounter with D&D or a preschooler, where each storyline is a set of 5 15-minute sessions. And if you have a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, you're probably just going to do one at a time. If you have a 6 or 7-year-old, you might do 2 or 3, and older than that, you might be able to play all 5 together. But each one has character blocks that literally just have like AC, HP, an attack. Is that it, Ryan?
That's it.
And then we simplified even we simplified the abilities into people. What was it, Ryan?
People, mind, and body, right? So we combine strength, dexterity, constitution into the body score. Charisma was people, and intelligence and wisdom was mind, and we just gave it the very simple language and the same number modifier.
Love that.
To make it really easy. So they just have a little square with a couple numbers on it, and each scenario is 15 minutes long, and there's always an option for a battle or a way to get out of it, because some kids have to kind of get into that fighting mindset. And then there's always a puzzle that meets a different type of intelligence throughout the storyline. So like Ryan said, the physical kids will get up. One of them actually has a game of dodgeball that impacts the game. And, puzzles or building towers or whatever. So that's kind of how we got started, slowly adding more and more elements as we go.
Wow. See, that's like exactly what I'm talking about. Because I think with all the complications that adults add in, we often forget about the fundamentals. And that's exactly what you're talking about there. You start with what is most important, which is the story. And then as, the child progresses, you add in the second most important part, which is sort of the challenge or the feeling that there is something at stake, right? Like that's why we read books, because we get invested and we're like, oh, what's going to happen? And I overall, it's just really, really, I'm infatuated by the concept of simplicity. Going back a little bit, I know we're sort of running short on time, so this will be my last question, and then Tanner, I'll let you kind of have a few more. But you said you have 3 big rules at the table, and you only mentioned one of those rules. So what are the other 2?
So the first big rule is that we treat everybody in the game with kindness, mercy, and justice. So this is all of the players around the table and all of the NPCs in the game. Kindness is the idea that the person that you are meeting is a full person, deserving of the same rights and responsibilities that you have. Mercy is the idea that you can meet the needs of that person. And justice is the idea that those needs come from something that's broken that you can fix. So all that together is the first rule: kindness, mercy, justice. And the second rule is we play by the rule of cool. So the dice help us give structure to our story. So if there's something that you want to do and you don't know how to do it, just ask and we will figure out how to do it. And then the dice will tell us if we can do it or not. And then the third rule is we play the game because it's fun.
Wow.
I love that.
And that
follow-up
first
question.
rule,
Yeah, go ahead.
can I just share a little anecdote? I just did a series for D&D Adventure Club. We did a play test for them. That's up on YouTube. And the kids I was playing with, they didn't know each other that well. So that first rule became really key in bringing them together for teamwork. And then the second part of it was kind of what you had touched on earlier, reminding them that the way that we're telling the story in this setting, some people maybe choose to do it otherwise, but we are the heroes of the story. We're not the villains. And that really helped a lot with getting them to make the same decisions versus, as you know, if you've ever played at a table with characters that are like opposite alignments, it makes it really hard. And a lot of the gameplay comes down to like the struggle, right, between people wanting to do two different things. But when we're playing with kids in this shorter, simple setting, it helps to set the stage that like, hey, we're working together toward a common goal of being the heroes.
Wow. I really love that. And just the one follow-up question I have is, how do you navigate that when it comes to combat encounters?
So most of the combat encounters that we have are with monsters uh, who have sort of if we're going by alignment, are evil, right? Can very clearly need to be stopped. The couple of times we've had combat encounters that are a little bit murkier are intentional, right? To give the kids the option or the ability to confront what is happening in a different way. For instance, one of the battles that we had in this first season, Allison's character V got captured, got taken away, and because Allison couldn't be there for a couple of sessions, so we wrote her out and then wrote her back in. But when she came back, she was being controlled by the big bad guy. And she had this big collar on that was making her making her attack her friends. And so the encounter became not let's kill our friend. It was, how do we free our friend? Turn by turn, what are the ways that we can get this collar off her, or stop the wolves that are with her, or whatever it is. So we try and make it a little more black and white with some of that stuff, just because it's easier for a kid who's in that concrete mode of operations to be able to sort of understand.
Yeah,
And I try to
like
make it really clear with our enemies, whether they are just going to be bad no matter what, and you only have one choice, or if they could maybe be convinced to become allies. I try to make that a little more clear than I think it usually is in adult games.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because already with like adults, it's hard to kind of wrangle them, make sure that they're, not just deciding to go all murder hobo on everybody, right?
Right.
But with kids, it's like, hey, we can avoid that, and also avoid all the kind of tug and pull between the different party members if you're just like, hey, you're supposed to be the hero. I'm kind of signposting pretty hard about like, no, this is a bad guy. Or I like the example of the controlling collar kind of thing, because you're like, hey, this is an encounter, but here's your objective, and I'm going to tell you the objective instead of. And I think that's something that we could do better with adult games too, because sometimes it feels like, oh, as soon as it's roll initiative, everybody's just like, well, I guess we're killing, instead of being like, hey, this is what you're trying to do. Now, if you need to kill someone, cool. If you don't, this is the primary objective. Being explicit that way, I think, helps a lot, and certainly with kids, but you could definitely port that to adults. I was very curious as we've been talking about this, because obviously our whole podcast is about how to be a better DM. Have any of the kids expressed interest in being DMs themselves?
Yeah, for sure. My son Beckett has expressed interest in being a DM, and we've sort of toyed around with that a little bit. He and I and Oren have told some stories where Beckett kind of gets to take the lead, and then I kind of take it back away from him because brother's not getting to play, right? I think that Alice too has expressed being a DM. Yeah, it's really cool because they love this game so much. They love the process of telling a story so much, and we have made it so easy and so fun that they think, yeah, I can do this, which is great because they can. They absolutely can.
Of course.
And that's the best part of it, right? Is giving kids the tools to do it on their own and to be their own storyteller.
And what kind of tools or advice, I guess, or help do you feel like you need to give them? Do you feel like they just picked it up as it was, or for the ones who have expressed interest, have you been like, yeah, that's a great idea. Here's what you can study or look at or prepare?
So I gave Beckett a couple of months ago the player's handbook and the DM's guide and the third book that I can't remember the name of right now. Whatever the third book
Monster
is.
Manual?
Monster Manual. Thank you. The Monster.
Yeah.
And he's just been like riveted. Like he's asking me questions about what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? And I would say one of the most important things that you can ever say to a kid is I don't know when they ask you a question. Because it gives them the permission to not know something and to find it out together, right? I feel like sometimes it's very easy for the DM to seem like the all-knowing, behind the screen, right, Wizard of Oz sort of character. But to say to a kid, like to say to Beckett, "Oh, I don't know why a beholder does that. Let's find out. Let's read that together and figure out why it does it like that, or why does an encounter flow like this, or right." It gives them the space to learn rather than be discouraged.
Wow,
beautiful. Yeah. Unfortunately, we're kind of at the end of our time, and I've just enjoyed this conversation so much. Maybe because I'm a parent, and I'm like thinking forward a couple of years, and but also I think for a lot of dungeon masters, hearing these, like I said, basic principles is very important because it does solidify, what is fundamental to doing this well, and then everything else is just details. So before we let you go, though, I do want to ask you a couple questions. First one, how can people reach out to you, support you, and see what you're up to?
Yeah, you can find us at the Kids Table DND on pretty much any social media. The main one for us is YouTube because that's where our full episodes of our original actual play campaign with kids at the table can be found. But we've also got clips and tips on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. We started on Twitch today. And if you're interested in our resources for playing at home with kids or even new players, you can search the Kids Table on dmsguild.com or itch.io. Or if you find us on any of those social media pages, you'll find a link in the bio to where you can get those downloadable resources.
Excellent. And speaking to the listener, if you enjoyed today's show, do us a favor and reach out to Ryan and Allison on Kids Table D&D and just give them a big thank you for us. That'll tell them how appreciative you are. And the last question is, based on our conversation today, what parting tip would you give to the Dungeon Master listening to make their games better? And this also includes you, Tanner, if you want to join in.
I think my tip for parents would be I get a lot of questions from parents who are very anxious about starting to play with their kids, and they feel like they need to do all this prep and memorize the whole DM's guide and everything. Just start playing. It's okay. Like Ryan said, if you don't know the answer, you can look it up or you can play rules light for a while until you get it under your belt. But just start playing together and just start telling stories together and go from there.
I think my tip would be a lot of the time we as adults think about what we would say to our younger self if we could talk to our 7-year-old self or 13-year-old self, what wisdom we would give them that would, help them in their journey. I want to flip it around and have you think, what would your 7-year-old self say to you? what kind of DM would your 7-year-old self need? And be that DM.
Man, that's really hard to follow up. I mean, make sure there's snacks. No, I'm just kidding. I think, I mean, I'm not joking about that. I think kids will have a good time with that. But to back it up, like I agree with the first comment. You know, keep it simple. I think especially where, you know, I think the worry is the parents or, you know, aunts and uncles playing with their nephews or whatever it is would be nervous to start because they want to do well. They want to impress. They want to make it so fun that the only option is to keep playing forever and be super involved. But that doesn't happen. What does happen is you can create a fun environment and you can play it a little loosey-goosey at the start and just throw some common fantasy tropes at them. Because unlike us adults who are burnt out on it, like they're new to it. So if they run into a pack of goblins, you might feel like, oh, this is so basic. It's like for them, this is the first time. And so keep it simple. Get them involved and excited about the feel of the game. And then from there, I think they'll just fall in love, right?
I gotta say, I think if nothing else, I am a better dungeon master because of this podcast episode. So thank you, Ryan, Allison, and Tanner for joining me on this show. Also, Ryan, thank you for that very thought-provoking prompt. I feel like that was something straight out of one of my therapy sessions. But to the listener, thank you for listening to this show. And like I said, reach out to the Kids Table D&D and enjoy their chocolatey goodness. I don't know if you guys have chocolate, but you should. And we'll be back next week with another amazing handcrafted episode just for you. But until then, let's go ahead and roll initiative. Brought to you by Session Zero Studios. For more information, visit sessionzerostudios.com.